resolute action.
I shall go to Korea.
I am not and never have been a member of the Communist Party.
We shall pay any price, bear any burden, support any friend, oppose any foe. Hell no, we won't go.
We believe that peace is at hand.
Will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States.
We understand each other better. That's a key to peace.
The Eagle and the Bear. Dispatches from the Cold War. Dateline, 1947, Washington.
The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? It is absolutely beyond the power of this committee to inquire into my association in any organization.
On October 26th, 10 Hollywood screenwriters were called before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. The aim was to investigate whether communists had infiltrated the film industry.
I am framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his answer to a question which invades his, absolutely invades his right.
The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union had come home. In the years since World War II, a powerful fear had taken hold of the American people, that Soviet-style communism might destroy American democracy. Fear of communism at home arose from the specter of communism sweeping through Europe. During World War II, Soviet communists had been American allies. As the war entered its final months, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin met President Franklin Roosevelt at Yalta and promised to hold free elections in Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe. But in the months following the war, the Soviets began to consolidate power. In countries under Red Army occupation, nearly every election ended in a communist victory. In March, Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill came to Fulton, Missouri, and told Americans the Soviets held Eastern Europe captive.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
I was at that time running for Congress of the United States in the 12th District of California. Let me say incidentally, my reaction to the speech was rather curious at the time. The communist issue had not yet become a big one. I appreciated the fact that the Russians had been our allies in World War II, as most people did. And I thought Churchill was too belligerent when I read the speech in the Los Angeles Times.
But Nixon used the threat of communism to win his first term in Congress. He told voters that Jerry Voorhees, their congressman for 10 years, was supported by communists. It was a tactic Republicans were using across the country. They pointed to Soviet advances in Europe and blamed the Truman administration. Democrats had been soft on the communists, they said. They pointed to unpopular post-war rationing and price controls in America and blamed the Democrats in Congress, just like the communists, they said. In 1947, President Truman answered by taking a tough stand on communism.
The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. We must take immediate and resolute action.
To meet the threat overseas, Truman proposed massive aid be sent to Western Europe, still ruined and vulnerable to communist insurgencies. Economic aid eventually became known as the Marshall Plan, and military aid went to keeping the Red Army from advancing beyond Eastern Europe, a policy Truman called containment. To rout the communists at home, Truman authorized the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover to begin loyalty checks on government employees. Soon, Hoover was telling Congress that the communist insurgencies were not confined to Europe.
The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column, if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation. Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life.
The Justice Department had issued a list of organizations suspected of being communist fronts. Among them, a number of Hollywood unions.
Calling the House Un-American Activities Committee to order, Chairman J. Parnell Thomas of New Jersey opens an inquiry into possible communist penetration of the Hollywood film industry. The committee is seeking to determine if Red Party members have reached the screen with subversive propaganda.
Ronald Reagan, president of the Screen Actors Guild, told Congress he could not name communists in his organization. Studio heads like the Warner Brothers were less charitable.
My brothers and I will be happy to subscribe generously to a pest removal fund. We are willing to establish such a fund to ship to Russia the people who don't like our American system of government and prefer the communistic system to ours.
But when the screenwriters took the stand, the tenor of the proceedings changed.
We're going to get the answer to that question if we have to stay here for a week. Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism.
We heard a plea from Washington via telephone telling us what was going on, how they were not allowed to voice their beliefs, their opinions, how everyone had ganged up on them, and suddenly they had lost their right of free speech.
A group of Hollywood celebrities, including Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart, went to Washington to protest the hearings.
And of course, I, being the smart age of like 22 years old, decided this crusade, you see, must be carried forth. And how dare anyone question what you believe in, that this was a democracy, it was a free country, and no one should be put in this position.
Bacall watched the proceedings from the gallery.
It was exciting to me in the middle of it, but it was very scary, because suddenly you felt that you were in jeopardy. And suddenly actually having to face the fact that maybe you were not free to believe as you always thought you were was very frightening.
It became clear the committee was not listening to protest.
Then you denied,
absolutely invades
then
his
you
right.
denied, you refused to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and everything else to the American public, and they will know where I stand, as they do from what I have written.
Stand away from the stand.
I have written for Americanism for many years, and I shall
stand away from the stand.
The 10 screenwriters were held in contempt of Congress. They were blacklisted by the major Hollywood studios. The House Committee on Un-American Activities had begun an unprecedented campaign that was to last for nearly a decade. The Eagle and the Bear will return in a moment. 1948, Americans were horrified when a Soviet-backed communist coup toppled the democratic government in Czechoslovakia. President Truman responded by openly denouncing the Soviets.
The Soviet Union and its agents have destroyed the independence and democratic character of a whole series of nations in Eastern and Central Europe.
But by April, the Soviets had closed East Germany to traffic from Western Europe, blockading supplies to West Berlin, still under U.S., British, and French control. U.S. forces got food to the Berliners in an airlift. It captured the imaginations of Americans and stirred popular anti-Soviet sentiment. In the summer of 1948, it began to look as though the threat was striking closer to home. Whittaker Chambers, a disenchanted communist, was naming communists in the State Department. One was Alger Hiss, a top diplomat under both Roosevelt and Truman. Hiss denied he even knew Chambers was a communist.
I first knew him as Crosley. What his name is today, I am not prepared to testify to, or what other names he may have had.
Mr. Hiss is lying.
Mr. Hiss is lying.
Chambers went on to say that Hiss had been a Soviet spy, that he'd passed secret State Department information to Chambers himself.
We were close friends, but we are caught in the tragedy of history. Mr. Hiss
represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting and I am fighting.
Richard Nixon, serving his second year in the House, led the investigation of Alger Hiss.
The fact that he was with Roosevelt at Yalta, the fact that he was a top member of the State Department bureaucracy, the fact that he was Secretary General of the first UN conference in San Francisco, that somebody in those positions could have been or had communist sympathies, and in his case, as it was later indicated, probably a member of the party, that really disturbed me.
As the hearings continued, President Truman was asked about the Hiss case. He called it a red herring, trumped up by his Republican opponents. Truman had reason to hope this was true. In the summer of 1948, he was in the middle of a presidential campaign. His Republican opponent was Thomas Dewey.
And what are we going to do about the communists here in our midst? Some people jeer at the problem, calling it a red herring. Some people get panicky about it. We will keep informed, and we'll keep the American people informed where they are, who they are, and what they're up to.
Truman won the election, but his Republican opponents kept the debate alive. China had fallen to the communists, and the Hiss case dragged on. There was new evidence, microfilm, allegedly copies of State Department documents Hiss had given to the communists. Chambers led federal investigators to this Maryland farm where they found the film hidden inside a pumpkin. Hiss was eventually convicted for perjury. By 1949, concern over Soviet espionage was mounting to hysteria. Quite suddenly, Russia had the bomb. A routine air reconnaissance mission over the Soviet Union returned with evidence of radioactive fallout.
One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many.
That winter, an obscure senator from Wisconsin named Joe McCarthy also gained national attention. McCarthy claimed there were hundreds of communists in the Truman State Department and that he would expose them. In less than a year, by dint of such bold statements, he'd become the self-anointed leader of the anti-communist crusade.
Even if there were only one communist in the State Department, even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
The Eagle and the Bear will return in a moment.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry, let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's best, get in step with us.
In the presidential election of 1952, the Republicans ran General Dwight David Eisenhower. As commander of NATO forces, he'd been holding the line against communism in Europe. His running mate was Richard Nixon, who'd made his name in the Alger Hiss case. The Democrats ran Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson's opponents branded him too intellectual, an egghead, and too liberal. Liberalism was not popular that year.
Walter Winchell of the New York Daily Mirror and the Washington Post. Mr. and Mrs. North and South American, all the ships at sea and in the sky. Washington. Senator Joseph McCarthy.
The fight against communism had moved beyond Washington. Fear of communism had become an American institution.
If you hurry and mail your special delivery airmail letter to me on why I could never be a communist, under 50 words, and enclose $1, you may be a winner.
War had broken out in Korea. The army of Soviet-backed North Korea had taken over most of democratic South Korea. And now, American soldiers were there fighting to beat them back. And if communists managed to take over the United States, the residents of Mosinee, Wisconsin staged a local version of what might happen.
There was a great deal of frustration. People didn't know what to do about communism. What could they do?
Ambrose Salamini waged a one-man campaign against communism. He made up records describing communist tactics and explicating the dark communist sensibility.
There are no moral boundaries beyond which a communist believes he ever trespasses.
By 1952, Senator Joe McCarthy had not come up with a single State Department communist. But he'd spent 2 years charging an array of top diplomats and turned the Senate into a kangaroo court. Anti-communist vigilantism had a new name, McCarthyism, and now it was touching the lives of all kinds of Americans. Dr. James Moss, a professor at Dillard University, led a New Orleans civil rights group.
Near the end of that semester, the president of the university called me in and indicated to me that he had heard that I was taking leadership in this committee, and that there were a bunch of communists, and I was being duped by them.
Moss left Dillard and moved to Queens College in New York, but he did not escape suspicion.
The government had planted within your classes people who were posing as students to monitor what comments you were making in class.
Fear was becoming a rule of law as well. In June 1953, Congress passed the McCarran-Walter Act. It called for the deportation of any immigrant or naturalized citizens believed to be subversive. Sam Burnson was an immigrant agent at Ellis Island, New York.
One of the things that would happen every so often is that someone would make an accusation against the person coming in and say he was a communist. That was the kiss of death, because that person would be on Ellis Island for years.
Felix Kuzmin had immigrated 20 years before. He was not a citizen and became suspected of having communist connections. His wife Helen says they were both harassed.
They did this by frequent visits from the FBI, who would visit at home, attempt to talk with us, numerous phone calls. People would follow us when we were in the car. We were followed sometimes. They would use all kinds of subterfuges. They used the subterfuge of calling me at work and telling me they were investigating my mother's credit rating. Actually, my mother had been dead over 4 years.
The message was clear. The federal government was hunting down communists and punishing them. In the spring of 1953, the Rosenbergs were to be executed for giving atomic secrets to the Russians. The couple maintained their innocence, and the sentence became the object of protests in Europe and the United States. Some believe the protests were orchestrated by the communists. Robert Lamphere worked on the case for the FBI.
We had thousands of American boys dying in Korea, and the idea that we would, at the height of the Korean War, give in to the protests that were being mounted by the Soviet propaganda machine was just unthinkable.
Eisenhower, now president, denied the Rosenbergs a stay of execution. Gloria Adrianson was assistant for the defense.
There was a steamroller going to finish this case because of the protests in Paris and Rome and Milan, all over the world.
In their final statement, read by a lawyer, the Rosenbergs said, "We told you the truth. We are innocent. The truth does not change." They were executed in June 1953. America was fighting fear by creating fear. In Hollywood, it looked like business as usual. Beneath it all, people were terrified. There were blacklists and gray lists, people testifying against one another, people losing their jobs, people going to prison.
The raw, harsh, unpleasant fact is that communism is an issue and will be an issue in 1954.
In 1953, at the height of his powers, McCarthy was stoking the fires of America's righteous rage.
You should remember that practically every issue which we face today, from high taxes to the shameful mess in Korea, is inextricably interwoven with the communist issue.
To all editors on the book pages, McCarthy and His Enemies. McCarthy and His Enemies is now a bestseller in the very first 2 weeks.
Backed by a growing contingent of true believers, McCarthy had become bolder.
Next Wednesday will reveal that Simon W. Gerson, a top Communist Party chief, was an Army instructor at Camp Upton.
Then, in 1954, As dramatically as he'd burst on the national scene, McCarthy fell. He was charged with using his power to seek special treatment for a staff member, G. David Shine, who had been drafted into the Army.
The Shine case is only an example of the wrongful seeking of privilege, of the perversion of power. It has been a distraction that has kept many men from the performance of tasks far more important for the welfare of this country than the convenience of a single Army private.
McCarthy's own subcommittee ran the investigation. In nationally televised hearings, McCarthy repeatedly interrupted, digressed, and usurped control of the proceedings. The spectacle of the Army McCarthy hearings had become an embarrassment. Even members of his own party were beginning to attack him. After the hearings, the Senate itself denounced Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy had been silenced, but McCarthy was a symbol, if an extreme one, of the fierce anti-communism that had taken hold of the American consciousness, and that outlived McCarthy himself. It was a legacy that would influence future presidents making crucial foreign policy decisions. Over the next 3 decades, a legacy that would help determine the course of the conflict between the eagle and the bear.
Monday, a network of sewers provide Holocaust survivors.
Leaves here fuller.